Welcome everyone to this approximately 2-hour video on self-portrait drawing. This video is being assembled in accordance with an online workshop that I'm doing through the Oklahoma Academy of Classical Art. And I'd like to thank Leslie Leno, and I'd like to put a big shout out to Chris Brizard and Deanne. Miss you both. So the normal course of action in a workshop is to come out to the city in question, to set up and do a demonstration, and to really run through or survey a number of different not only techniques but thought processes, varying things that go into your own personal way of working. And that's what this video is designed to accomplish. It's a kind of pseudo demonstration before the fact. So I hope you enjoy it, hope you get a lot out of it. Before I begin, I'd like to lay out a few of the materials that I'm going to be working with. And so I should get to the pencils. The pencils primarily are going to be Mitsubishi Hi-uni. This is an amazing company that makes fantastic graphite pencils, have for many years. I'm going to be working through the line of Mitsubishi pencils primarily, mostly through these. So FYI on that. The second range of materials regarding pencil drawing involves the darker part of the range. So I'm also going to be using these Monolith pencils by Cretacolor for some of the more fluid graphite passages that go darker in the drawing. And I'm also going to shift gears from those to a less shiny, less reflective graphite surface, which is accomplished through a Mars Lumograph pencil made by the Staedtler company in Germany. So these are two contemporary pencils. This one is an 8B Lumograph in blue, and then the dark one is called a Mars Lumograph black. And those of us who draw a lot in graphite need to have something that's a little bit less reflective, because it just factors into the process, as we well know, and certainly does when you're trying to film a drawing. So the other aspect of working is, what are you drawing on? So I've got some Strathmore 400 series paper, the classic brown cover paper, acid-free. This is the one you'll find everywhere, and this is what I'm going to work on, and I will pad the paper. So also, before I get started, I wanted to say a word or two about self-portraiture. There is something categorically fascinating about self-portraits all over the place. I just looked at several for a presentation of the Philadelphia Club, and there's just something that's almost indescribably interesting about walking through a museum and looking at a self-portrait, studying the way that an artist has envisioned himself or herself, what affectations they have placed on their own image, what sort of pretense may have been there, what kind of countermeasures they may have instilled to drastically avoid pretense. It's terribly interesting, so I hope you find it just as fascinating as I do. But to get you there, to get you a little further along, I'd like to read a quote out of this book called Painting and the Personal Equation. I know we're doing a drawing class, but this is from Charles Woodbury's book. It was put out in 1919, and I think it's pertinent, so here goes. The actual manipulation of the brush is a skillful matter, yet it requires more intelligence than manual dexterity. Art is psychology, not science, and there must ever be one unknown factor, the personal equation. You must know what you see, why you see, and what is worth seeing. So I hope that in addition to a kind of a procedural or technical survey of this, we can get into some of what is worth seeing. Knowing where to look on this model is really challenging because we're so confounded by familiarity, frankly, with the skull. We know what it looks like. We've seen it before. I find, in a strange kind of anecdotal sort of way, that people that look at Halloween posters are even confounded to look at a skull because they're used to seeing an evil tinge to this form. Be that as it may, I tried to help you discern a few places on the face to look for when it comes to the real estate of the skull. So I did that by marking on my own face. So I want to point out to you some of the features on my own face and why they're so important. Again, why it's worth looking at. So the first thing is to go up into my forehead region. I've articulated in two different colors. I've got a color black for bony landmark, and then I've got a brown color for a sort of rhythmic operational sense, taking the form into account when you draw, allowing the form to flow and to kind of influence the territory of the head and the territory of the skull as you try to evaluate what you're doing, what you're drawing. So this is called the frontal eminence. It's on the frontal bone. We have two of them. They can sometimes be asymmetric. We generally identify them as symmetrical, though, and they tend to be very subtle mound-like double structures that send a rhythmic flow down toward another landmark, which is called the sinus eminence. You can see that the two sinus eminences, which sit either side of a thing called the glabella, are a little bit closer together. And when I take into account the frontal and the sinus, you see they formulate this sort of trapezoidal plane. And we get used to looking at that a lot in both master painting, but also in our own drawing, in our own self-portraits. So on the lateral side is a thing called the temporal ridge, which I've shown in brown again, and that will sweep down and begin to connect and communicate with the eye socket in a kind of rhythmic way on both sides. Then as I descend, I go a little lower along the midline and through here, and I'm studying my nasal bone structure. I'm going to place the end of it right about here and the beginning of the cartilaginous mass. And you can generally tell this on your own nose if you go to scratch your nose. Whichever part doesn't move is going to be the part that holds on to the nasal bone structure. So again, a variable point from one person to another. If I move laterally, I'm in a couple of really interesting landmark areas. I've got a brownish marker here for a thing we artists like to call the infraorbital furrow, which can go a little further down and laterally. It's a really interesting part of the human face, and it connects us with the superficial facial pads and fascia and other landmarks. Above that, and through this region, is a lower eyelid furrow, which again I have outlined in brown on both sides. A bit hard to see, but key to formulating the planar cohesiveness of this region. Going up above, I've got two things to point out. One is the eye cover fold. Once more, a little bit difficult to see and to figure out, but once you get your model's eyes moving, let's say you pose him or her looking down, it's a lot easier to see the eye cover fold as they look around. And important because you want to separate the eye cover fold from that lateral, supraorbital ridge, that eye socket, which again can be somewhat asymmetrical as it is on me. So a bit more medial, and I'm starting to look at this core structure here and here, which really is sort of a deep triangular plane of the face. A really fascinating moment to organize your eyes around and your forehead around, because you see the whole business converges up into this pocket right here. Really fascinating. So I'll keep going. I have these alar cartilages, which those of you who know me know I'm a champion of those alar cartilages in the way that they are depicted in the book by Stephen Rogers Peck. He does a great job in showing you a three-quarter view with those forms in it. You can see my curved red structures here, or orange, or whatever the case may be. What they are designed to do is somewhat like the frontal eminences where they enclose the landmark. These are going to enclose the alar cartilages and get you thinking about the nose as really a combination of two egg-like forms that become the so-called ball of the nose. So artists are going to want to think about that so-called ball as being more like two halves that are combined in very peculiar, wonderful ways in the human face. As I go back away from that area, I hit what I call a catch point, which is a separation between the ball and the sort of fatty nose structure back here, the nostril area. So I have that on either side, and then a bit lateral to that, I have a pretty extensive long line which we call the nasolabial fold, or sometimes the nasolabial furrow. You can see that tends to drop down and reverse curve itself And as it continues, it runs right into a thing called the node. A bit difficult to talk about while we're discussing the landmark. But that is on either side of the mouth, and it's part of what makes the mouth want to separate from the nasolabial fold. You don't want to pull that line down to the corner of the mouth. There's always some separation between the corner and the nasolabial fold. And the node, as you can tell from my face, can be large, it can be small. It really depends on the individual and the individual manifestation of the form. Continuing then, I might go over to the side and look at the angle of the jaw here, which is an extensive and fascinating structure to look for. Lots of form associated with that. And then I have this U shape in brown really circling around this moment here, which is, for all intents and purposes, associated with the zygomatic structure of the face. There's a lot of really interesting stuff when you think about the bony framework of this and how much soft form is really pulling under. So it should be no surprise that I'm making a U shape to wrap the soft form around the bony framework. As I continue past this line right here, I move down to these moments here and here. These are called the mental tubercles, and they are critically important for setting the perspective up in the head. So I've marked those in black. Again, black crosses or black pluses. And I've allowed the brown to issue a sort of influence of the landmark sort of structure on the face, so you can look at that when you set up your own chin. Elsewhere, a bit more on the midline, I've got a rounded form, which is associated with the mentalis muscle, the sort of pouting muscle. And above that, a critically important and fascinating form called the mentolabial sulcus, really a kind of a vortex or a depression area in the human face, and really a good thing to look for before you set up the familiarity in the mouth. To get that sulcus established along with the rest of the midline is really helpful because it carries everything into a placement phase and allows you to issue certain parts of the face in a kind of projected way. Speaking of that midline and that projection and recession, as I drop a bit further down, I hit my neck, I hit my hyoid bone, which you want to be able to feel and place, because the hyoid, being that great horseshoe-shaped bone, is not only the termination here of the lower triangles that slide off of the jaw and give you perspective. It also is the summit of the throat structure. And so I've gone in and located my thyroid cartilage and a little bit of my thyroid gland going down to my trachea, which I can really feel down here, which lies really squarely in the suprasternal notch. So this gives you a sense of some of the key players that I'm going to use in the drawing, irrespective of the bone structure. There's a lot of information in the face, obviously, but also in the self-portrait. So you want to establish, what are you looking for? What's important to see and why? The why part's going to have a lot to do with what stage you are in the drawing. If you begin the drawing, you're in a different why and in a different mindset than you would be if you're in the finish of a drawing. So now I'm setting up for the drawing. I haven't started yet, but to me this is a very important moment to talk about how you set up your light. And in setting up my own light, I really wanted to have two light sources in this case, not just one. Some lighting can be narrative. Some lighting, as we all know, can be very pictorial and say a lot in terms of mystery. I think in this case, the lighting should be more appropriate to what's able to be gained from an experience like this, to what can light teach us about the form sense and what's going on in our head. And I think with regard to the earlier discussion and all the stuff I put on my face, what is this light doing to testify to the importance of these landmarks that I'm trying to press so vigorously in this talk? So let's get into it. As I look at the lighting, you can see that, again, I've got the two lights. The one is more intense. As these two crisscross each other, they render a portion of my face in shadow. The shadow, you'll see, is not even, and that's very good. That's very important. That in part accounts for the fact that one of the lights is in front of my face and one is a bit more behind my face. When these lights sort of interfere with each other, the part that is in shadow doesn't just go into shadow indiscriminately. it tends to organize itself according to the landmarks and according to the planar references which follow those landmarks. So as I look at the most intense part of the light from my own left side, it runs up and crosses through this temporal ridge area and then makes a direct change in tonality as it maneuvers its way sort of up the plane and through here between temporal and frontal and sinus. And then you can see it gets somewhat darker before it lightens up again. And there's that big mound that I mentioned earlier on today. Somewhat before the end of that mound, the light starts to slip back into the shadow range and flatten out as it travels somewhat plainly across the flat portion of my forehead to then re-emerge on the other side and begin to get round again. So as I look at that, I notice it gets lighter and lighter in accordance with this other light source. Not quite as light as it is over here, but as I try to account for all of those portions of value change, it gives me a greater appreciation of the manner of turn in my forehead, as well as the turn that's along the longitudinal side of my frontal bone and frontal plane area. As I drop down from that region, I'm back in the sinus. You can see the sinus area is getting shadow in this case, more or less. Then I drop down further. I'm in glabella. I'm in the nasal area, the nasal bone. Again, I can keep part of my nose where it is. And then I look at these very distinctive lines which are created by the effect of light and shadow, and they really ally themselves to my infraorbital region of my eye and really tie nicely into this region over here, which is associated with zygomatic ridge, getting its own kind of cascading highlight. As I look over to my nose, I've got my alar region. This is beautifully articulated with the light, again, running into and scraping the underside of my nose plane with a nice highlight, really underscoring the importance of that form and our interest in projecting that form off the plane of the face. Then I look down into my philtrum, where I get these two curves. Very narrow area, just like this, very unlike the forehead region because of the taper of the planes. Then I'm back in my nasolabial fold hair area here, and I've got a little bit of a recessed plane, somewhat. So I would relate this back to that and try to use it to set up my facial structure and to allow me to see how to pull all of this together in a planar respect. Then I drop down further. I've got that nice shadow kind of running through and obscuring some forms, and that runs right into my sulcus, gives me some reference back to my mentalis muscle, back to my mental tubercle, and there's that perspective I was talking about. You really want to mind that as you go into your setup of your head. So this can take a while, and it shouldn't necessarily take you no time at all. It's really important because when you invest the time in what you want to do, you should have a light that spells it out fairly easily and fairly succinctly for your own benefit. So what I want to do next is get started with the drawing. So we'll take another quick break and get rolling. I'm going to get started with the 2H from Mitsubishi. Again, it's a Hi-uni. It's a hard lead to see, so it may be necessary to adjust any settings in your program. But it is the beginning, and sometimes it's helpful to see the very beginning of a piece. And you can see me surrounding the paper mainly, not just a head, shoulders, but the entire paper space with a network of lines that aren't meant to be anything other than testing lines. For me, anyway. And I'm not proposing that my way is the best way to do it, but it works for me. So I've got a few simple markers that, speaking of cascade, travel down through that pattern of shadow in my face. And they help me to establish a top and appropriately a life-size arrangement, giving my head ample position on the paper to, as I say, breathe in, breathe out. Everybody does this when they set up a self-portrait, or any portrait for that matter. They tend to adjust and readjust scale, so that's why I'm going to stay with the 2H for a little while. And just let it set. It's a good idea to lay in some diagrammatic lines because they're simple and they give us a feel for where we are. Like so many strings or straight angular markers. Of course, the reason why we use the angle is because it's so much more convenient to switch over to the curve when one is ready than it would be, because we are literally building the subtlety and the sophistication of the curve with the raw characteristics of the straight. The straights are no nonsense. They're very clear, and drawing with a clear sense of where one is a pretty good place to be in a drawing. So you can decide if you're wrong about a certain decision or right. But a curvature can be so refined to be utilized early on that I just simply go with straights often enough. And you can see I will double up a lot of these straights. It makes me think more about painting in a sense. But it also helps me to not too early, that is to say, not too soon, get into what I'm drawing. It's much more about the idea of the light and shadow pattern and responding to the interest that we may have observed when we set up the drawing itself. There may have been something that appealed to you, as there probably should be, when you first set up your image. And instead of going in and finding all those landmarks, we try to find the pattern of shadow and light, because there's an interest to it, because it's a natural occurring thing with the light that we set up. So what appeals to me is a kind of multi-directional calligraphy that sort of congregates through this region of the face. And a line I'm making, which in this case would be a sort of disastrous line for perspective, is a great line for shape and for calligraphy, because it doesn't really have to devote itself to any nameable form. It just really sits in there and justifies itself by its sheer visual appeal. And then branching out to a few other important elements here. Good idea to get the sense, like the lay of the hair shape in your own face, because it does give you not only a framing device, but a tendency and sometimes a clue into the way to deal with form and form making. Form can be very upright. It can be, you think of like a nose, which may be lifted up in space, or it could hang. And I definitely have a hanging form sense with the way that this hair shape is falling on my shoulders. You can see the angles in through here, coming through the sternomastoid, dropping off of that area. So what may have started out as a series of disparate markers can turn into a longer line. We don't always begin with the longest line. Sometimes we have to earn the longest line by means of association. As many of you know me, know that I operate under the assumption that we have to avoid getting too human too soon. So that's why you see me not pursuing eyeballs right now. It's not going to work. The idea instead is to follow the shapes and the angles and just get into it and let the whole drawing just sort of talk to itself for a little while. That is, let the shapes communicate and sort of build up to a certain presence in the drawing. It's going to take some time to establish, but that's okay. That's the way it goes. It's just it's the reason why the demonstration is being pre-filmed, so that I can focus on this, and then if there are any comments as this is being shown, I can address those directly, being focused on the comments when this airs. So part of that positioning is intended to pull a sense of a shape that will become a neck later, to pull that back. And I've been in a lot of workshop situations where a neck doesn't even begin as a thought until well into a drawing. And I think a neck should begin early, and an ear, likewise, should begin early, because there's something so primordial about the way that they address the setup, posture, gait, gesture, perspective, and structure of a head. So you can see my testing lines throughout. There's a general kind of pattern that we see repeated from face to face. It's such that when I survey the territory up in this region, I really feel like I'm diving down into a kind of V shape. I believe that's common, having something to do with the frontal eminence relationship, the crown of the head up above, the keel of the frontal plate up and through here, and then those bilaterally symmetrical or otherwise pieces of bone that guide a lot of that mark making in the beginning. And I don't feel like that at all when I get down into a region like this. I feel instead like I'm dropping and widening as I set. And that's going to again be an abiding concern as we look at relating markers. So within the scope of this first phase, I'm going to stay on the 2H, the Mitsubishi Hi-uni 2H, and I'm going to address the relationships of these initial diagrammatic marks, these searching marks. I'm not going to move on until I get a sense that I'm in the right framework and until I establish momentum. If I don't establish any momentum, then I'll start over. No problem. So you really want to sharpen your thought process about where you are in your sequence, in your procedure, and don't let your sort of emotions get the best of you when you're setting up a drawing or a painting. Try to let everything kind of set in as a matter of, let's call it a logical, visual layering, layered insights. So to me, it doesn't make any sense to start going after anything until I get this set. So one of the things I can do in a moment, once we pause, is check the scale. I want to make sure that my scale isn't too big and isn't too small, but fits right around life size. Because there's something about exercising life size modeling, shading, form appreciation, that just helps. It helps all the time. And it comes back to assist you when you're thinking about the sculptural nature of what it is you're drawing. Life size. Another thing is just to make sure when I stand back and squint and otherwise that this has a good feel in terms of the situation, the perspective, and overall carriage of the head, and overall feel of the width to the height, the posture, the shoulder shapes. And then I'll dive back in here and address the same information in a relative sense for a little while longer, and then we'll get started again. Back on the drawing, and this is really what I wanted to articulate earlier on in the drawing, but it just takes a while to get this type of mark making positioned, fleshed out in a certain way, and like I said, articulate. It's not enough from an instructive standpoint to say something. That's why these pre-recorded videos I think are very useful, because I can stop on certain moments, prescient moments that I think are very helpful. So let's talk about it before we move on. It's, first of all, it's a two-tone system. We sometimes say the phrase binary no-tan in the business, which means just dark and light. And if you really think about it, it's really kind of just one tone, because all we have is a 2H pencil. Everything's done in 2H. There's been a small amount of stumping to pull the graphite together, but all that's left over is just a series of interlocking, kind of raggedy, blocky looking light paper shapes. And that's by intention. Everything at this point in time has to come together as shape phenomenon before it turns into anything anatomical, before it turns into an eyeball, before it turns into a mouth. Turning it into a mouth now is actually going to destroy the whole process and derail the entire sequence of the drawing for me. So I want to show this as a matter of kind of interlocking, interthreaded, overlapping markers that sit in here and really become part of what makes this process so invigorating. The beginning is really the fun part, and if you give yourself enough time and enough contemplation on what you're seeing, then you should find yourself at a moment like this, a kind of an identified section of the drawing where you can just sit back and say, well, I've got something here, and I just want it to gestate, I want it to develop and turn into a very poignant thing. So to continue, the patterns and where they're traveling. So I've got that flattened area and that kind of longer hatch mark crossing down, and as I study it through my own forehead, it seems to be making its way into the nose neighborhood or something. There's enough of a similarity that I can issue a hatch mark that's really in the same family, and I can even go back in through here and look at the crossing patterns of the flat tonality as it moves away from that midline off toward the lateral side. I then almost have a repetition here, but it's not quite settled. It's going to turn into a hair shape, and then later on in the drawing process, it's going to transform itself into a plane. So I want to set that up. I've also got some things on the other side like this. It's really not a shadow, and that's a beautiful point to make about this phase of the drawing. It's a formative phase. It doesn't have to be shadow and light. It can be dark and light. It can be something that you just allow your pencil to show and group together with other things so that the entire process has this kind of holistic set of concerns. With that in mind, there's also a focus on the overall simplification of the hair shape, to keep it holistic. There are a couple of other lines of implication that move up toward the jaw from shoulders on both sides. There's a fair amount of crossing pattern here, and kind of a shadow that sits on the edge of both lights, settling into the throat mass. And that is a really fun area to draw. So I'll get working into that a bit more. And I think I will also utilize the F in the near future to go along with my 2H. Let's see, finally in this one particular section of the presentation, I want to begin showing some of the corner of what's going to turn into a mouth form. But you can see from this, it's very preliminary. Preliminary because it doesn't have to be a mouth. It only has to be the beginning of the emergence of that shadow shape to separate the light from the shadow. And then we can move it all over the place because, again, this is just simply white paper. So I'm going to do that for a bit. I'm going to stick in a few other minor but significant markers that really sit into the opposing shadow, if that makes any sense. This is one leaking in from that light source. This is one coming in from the other light source. And this sets up a repetitive pattern of its own. The other thing about the self-portrait, as a matter of practice, is whatever one chooses for this becomes very resonant and important in the way that the expression of a self-portrait orchestrates itself. So it's something that you want to place and step back and look at from a distance, because you may not have the kind of expression that you want as you set this up. And so now is the time. You can turn these patterns into facial emblems, expressive indicators, as you see fit. So that's kind of where I am. As we move on to the next phase, I'm going to start specifying some of these features and some of the structure within the shape, utilizing more of an F, but I'm going to stay in the pattern, in the shape, and just really kind of resource or farm out the shape as the drawing develops, because there's something really super interesting and organic about the way the shape is distributed within my face, and I'm sure within yours as you set this up and try something on your own. I've reached a point in time where I can begin to flesh some of the feature readouts, indications, footprints, so to speak, out of the shapes. And yet things are still in a very open format, implying lots of flexibility. And this is a section of the drawing that I think we should spend more time with as we study the portrait, as we study the figure, because it's a time when you can make a lot of changes very easily. And rather than trusting that you can get everything perfectly figured out much later, when the tonality is there, when you may have a rude awakening if you don't have it figured out, I think it's apt to work it out early on. So that's what you see me doing at this point in time with the shapes. And it involves a good bit of back and forth of, like I said, being flexible, give and take. So a few examples are taking the overall head proportions and shrinking them this way, and lowering my features this direction, which, you know, opened up the space here, I think somewhat appropriately. I think I have a lot of space right there, and I tend to have a very slight but noticeable incline in this region. What's really important is eventually to get a good sense of the bone structure, to reach through this area almost like a curved line and project a forward-facing convex plate that's sort of looking up. And that has yet to be achieved, but that is in the works. What's also critically important is that whatever's going on with that decision and that shape, that it gets pointed in a way that it can communicate the right framework to all of this. So eventually we need to indicate a few markers up in through here that allow us to rotate appropriately the overall cranial form so the cranium and the face don't face in different directions. Elsewhere, as I descend, I've got two very alternate looking pathways of shape and pattern here. I'm looking out in this direction, and I don't have as much on the other side. I have kind of a distinctive outburst of the edge of hairline here, but I really have a recessed plane dropping in this direction. And what I think I can do with that is lay out just the slightest whisper here of hatch so that one side can teach the other. And that's one of the great things about the portrait, especially the self-portrait, is one side can teach the other. I was watching fairly recently yet another account by an art historian claiming that artists like drawing the self-portrait because we're just here and we are our own model. But there's a lot more to it than that. There are things that we can study with a certain degree of intensity that I don't think people that don't do self-portraits could quite understand. And that's the kind of thing. It's a really intense, kind of close-looking exercise. So it's also a lot of conceptualizing of your own head, using your head as a model, so to speak. So what that means is you don't have to be afraid of the model. You don't have to flatter yourself. You don't have to do anything that you wouldn't want to do. In fact, you don't have to do anything at all with the self-portrait. You could practice it and put it away, put it back in a folder. But if it turns into something that really teaches you and propels your insight, your understanding in a much more insightful way, then it becomes fuel for further pursuits and in a way does its job. So you see me walking sort of in a similar direction this way. I'm going to have to shift and pull. And that can give me some association back down into the nose area. You can also notice that there's a lot of this which is very, very open. That goes to my point about adaptability. If I need a shape to say something about the configuration of my own face and it doesn't, I'm not going to be as fond of the shape if it's really hard-edged. I like to keep things open and kind of soft in a sense, not because I don't like hard edges, because I like everything to communicate with everything else. So once I change this around, I have to kind of back away conceptually and look at everything in a different manner. Did I stretch in a new sense a different part of the face by compressing another part of the face? So I think it's better, I think, to conceive of it that way than to finish piece by piece and forget about it, or to be too caught up in what you're listening to rather than what you're seeing. Another helpful thing is working the total portrait, everything together, and having your own hair or having a garment that you can take on or off. You can isolate the light and shadow shape. You can see the same form in different illuminations, which helps you to understand how to really envision a central structure like this one in the face of the framework that sits around it. This could be much like what we could be seeing through here. I'm going to pull this shape and send the message here that it's receding, that it's going back. And that's what that edge shadow, the so-called terminator or shadow accent, can do for us. By positioning it back in this space and following the pattern you see, I can not only drop down to a kind of moment, a real moment where my throat mass peaks, I can then recede even further in through here, and this will be a delightful shadow shape to explore as the portrait continues. And, anchors I should say this shape as I keep going, it tends to anchor itself down in this region, which in addition to all the other fun we're having, gives us a nice clean indication of the edge of sternomastoid as we drop down along that perimeter, the perimeter of the shirt. So I may have this too long, I'll check it out, but doing a lot of proportional thinking and stretching and compressing as the case may be. Stretching in the form of something like that. I'm picking and lowering shapes to afford the right kind of distribution of this, distribution of that. But in accordance with the elongation of sometimes the central players in the portrait, I'm also pulling in very slightly, so there are parts of the portrait that are incredibly momentous in the form of how much of a difference they make to the entire drawing. And you have to watch that, because you might pick out something that is just strange because it's giving you a read that it shouldn't. So an example, this shadow shape isn't really the eye, it's what's around the eye. And what I'm after, what I'm striving for, is that where a feature is, it needs to be indicated in light shape. Where a feature is not, can't be misinterpreted by the same sort of light and dark shape. I think that's a very interesting part about drawing, is that you're not only managing form and impression, you're also managing the way that your own sort of synapses relate to what you're seeing, the way that the image registers, and we call that Gestalt theory in the business. But really it's the question of how something reads and how you can control the read so it doesn't become too stark and sudden and lay waste to your design, but also how you can manage it and get it more precise when it's necessary to do so. That takes us back to the game, the sequence, the logic, and how you want to work the incredible language of visual design to your aims. So, speaking of design, never miss an opportunity. So I've got this other sort of perimeter here, this collar, and I could make something out of it. So I should explore some of that in the next couple of minutes and see if I can turn it into something that really matters, that makes a difference in a positive way in this design, that reinforces the notion that this is a unique moment, that this piece, like any other, really counts, really matters in the development of my own way of seeing, your way of seeing, developing a body of work perhaps, or at least coming to terms with a region of the figure that we haven't yet explored thoroughly enough. I suggest it anyway. Never miss an opportunity. We also continue, and this relates back to the read I was referring to, we continue to not zero in on a feature too much, to really allow pieces of the face that haven't gotten the necessary attention to flower, become noticeable and appreciated, and contribute in their own special way to what's going on. So it could be something like this, where I've really got to manage the read so that I don't accidentally read this as one giant eyebrow. It's brow, it's sinus, it's glabella, the somewhat concentrated lines I have in my own face. It's also a very slight, noticeable amount of eye socket, bone structure. And I want to make sure that that bone structure sits in a way that pushes the form in a kind of upthrust, meaning that this relates to this in that way that sweeps me back into the head. Sometimes, again, it's easier to read as a foreshortened component than as a more broadly seen element. Also, I spent quite a bit of time back in here, trying to afford enough space with zygomatic, with this kind of out of control sideburn, and with the kind of buildup that leads to an ear, because an ear isn't going to be tacked onto the side of the head. It's going to create itself out of a groundswell of bone structure. So a lot of what really makes it count isn't the feature itself. It's the lead-in, the bridge between the feature and the overall governing head structure. And that's a fun thing to celebrate. So we'll not only pursue that, we're also going to pursue a feeling of the ear. Does the ear have a flair to it? And if it does, is there some way that we can instill that similar flair on the other side of the head? And in fact, get that even to configure itself into the column of the neck muscle, the sternocleidomastoid. If that can happen, then we'd really be looking at something fine. So we'll work toward that and see if we can get some of that prepped in the shape here as we bridge between shape and structure. I did fairly recently wind up creating a mini tutorial out of an ear, or excuse me, out of a neck, which may be interesting to look at. If you want more information, then I'm happy to share it later. But the neck is one of those regions that really deserves its own, not only mini tutorial, but long form workshop / intensive study. Because there is so much going on in it, and it's not too incomprehensible. And just to get fairly good at it gives you a lot of strength in the development of your skill as a portraitist. And not to have it creates a lot of awkwardness, likewise, in the same pursuits. So I recommend pursuing it and, again, using yourself as much as you can, because you are the ultimate resource in ways that art historians can't understand. Just about the conclusion of part 1. And for whatever reason, I've got that Woodbury quote on my mind. You must know what you see, why you see, and what is worth seeing. And what I see is a kind of map to the expression of my own face. And it just gets me thinking, if I can go off on a tangent on this for a moment, that's sort of non-technical, that some of my favorite works in the museums are self-portraits. And there is such an intense psychology to looking at yourself and scrutinizing your face and seeing it change. And I'm one who happens to believe that the biography is written on the face. And I think that's very, very interesting. So it's not so much a question, after doing a bunch of these, of seeing the nose. What I see are landmarks that lead me to facial expression and to a record of whatever you'd want to call it, experience. I could refer to them in technical ways, and I certainly will point a few out. But it's how they resonate that goes to the what is worth seeing part, because there's a tremendous amount worth seeing. And this just takes me back to the notion that drawing is art appreciation class, because of the way that drawing teaches you to really look at something and someone and contemplate it. So in looking at my own face for the next couple of seconds, I certainly want to allow markers to delineate where the zygomatic is going to be positioned in a future session here. And I've got that. I've also got a marker here, and I happen to think that something that lays to rest right at the base of the nostril is also going to be useful. I may cover that up to some extent in the next couple of days, but I'll leave it and sort of leave a louder statement, if that makes any sense, a louder shape statement of my own head, so that I can come back to this, engage it with a fresh eye on a different day. Elsewhere, I've worked a little bit more into the neck region, and I've played around with this collar. I'm still playing around with it. And what I wanted to do was lift this up because I felt like it would give me a bad read of the physique, the elongation of my own body. I am not a person that has a super tall frame, so I don't want to make a super tall neck. So that's part of it. Another interesting issue about the relationships of these is there's a usefulness to the shadow shape right here that kind of sets the equilibrium and makes itself into a marvelous pivot point. It's hard to qualify that in any sort of way, but again, if you draw, you know what I'm talking about. You got to have something to make the foot plant itself on the paper, on the model stand, and that's what a mark like this can do for a neck, to plant itself in a way that this side of the neck just can't do, because it's off on an expressive tangent, so to speak. So as I lay some of this shape out, some of what's also worth seeing is the spread into the shoulders, because shoulders lead into gesture, which leads into biography, gait. Proportion is one thing, but gesture is something so much more impactful because it's so immediate. I also addressed some of what was happening up in here, and I decided, just based on the light and shadow that I get at the end of the day, that I'm not quite getting as much expanse on my hair as I thought I was. I really want to get the canopy of my cranium to set itself up, and as I was saying earlier, to point itself in the right direction. So I went into this region and I started issuing a slightly different hatch mark to begin to think as much as possible about the tendency of form to fall backward. Fall backward, which is somewhat like the line of a hat, if one was thinking about a hat emerging in space. So I've got a few markers that I can use as I expand the value range in the next session to help me accomplish that, to help me not only roll backward, but also have form sit in that specialized plane as it's going back in space. Elsewhere, I worked this to a more obvious placement for the time being. That helps me a great deal, placing and relating and thinking about projection with that form. And I just generally spent whatever time was necessary in this phase getting things to set up in a certain way. So I'll reiterate in closing that it pays to go back and look at the drawing the next day or the third day and see what your fresh eye tells you. Trust your instinct and make a note of what you learn over and above the technical, because that goes to the what's worth seeing part, to the thing that makes self-portraiture so special part that we're talking about. These shapes can be very open-ended, and should be. It's going to be a different situation. It's going to be a different drawing in a day or so, with more of a focal point, more of a dedicated section, more of a narrative. And at this point in time, we're earning the right to pursue that end by what we see and what we celebrate. It's never just a drawing. They've all got to mean something, because how many do you have in you? So this will kind of set me up a little bit. You can see that there is a little bit more going on than the simple tone now. Don't need much, but what I wind up having here is something that it might sound corny, but I think of drawing on top of graphite and not drawing on top of paper. So the H pencils are amazing for setting up the graphite surface that further layers of graphite wind up blending into almost melting or bleeding or washing into, and graphite becomes a kind of pseudo painting material, depending on how you handle it. It's always inherently linear at a time like this, but it's also something that, although it is linear, it isn't such a good idea to obsess on the line or on the hatch, because what we're doing is using flat tonality and testing out hatch, testing it out because the tones, are going to disappear as we go into flat tonality. In the next phase and in the next series of layers and values that develop, that's when the hatch mark really matters. This gives me some more compositional information that I can think about. So with that, I think I'll call the first phase to a conclusion, and we'll pick it up in the next section. We're in the second session of the drawing now, and I've spent some time working through the shapes, and I really haven't done a lot different from what had previously been talked about and performed here. Really what is important to point out is there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of moving and shifting, and again, this is a terrific time to work your positioning into a kind of a halfway point between what you see in terms of optics and perception and what you can also organize regarding a form and a structure. So it's a kind of hybrid between basic structure and essential shape. So it's a terrific time to go after the kind of imprint of your face and commit to, or begin to commit to, what's going on with your features, with the placements of your proportions, and with the nature of how you get things to push forward or pull away from you. So as I look at the passage of shadow through my neck, I have all these little channels that seem to distribute in very particular ways. So I'm sitting here now asking more about what this is going to eventually turn into rather than what it appears. And you'll recall from earlier in this discussion, it was more about how something looked. And the look was a kind of comprehensive shape map that informed us in a certain way and got us started in a very literal sense. So as I look at this, I'm sort of beginning to contend with the idea that I have these little volumes that need to become more expressive and structured and through here. And then I lift up into this particular section, and I've got a jawbone with its own peculiarities and its own kind of volumes, sub-volumes, sub-forms, and pointed areas. So here, this is what I mean. I'm in the sort of midpoint between looking at a shape and looking at something that's going to flesh out more structurally. Then as I look up, I work this area as well, and I try to get some connection into the region of the sulcus and back down and through this tubercle area. There's a bit of asymmetry, and that's part of the interest, frankly. So I look in through these areas. I make a kind of a combination out of this form, which I did, and I kept the value very, very simple so that I could squint my eyes at what I see and just sort of pick and choose what's going to look right, what's going to look like it's projecting to a certain place and sitting in front of another form and even sitting behind a third form. So as I look up at this, I can see the passage of shadow and light pushing out to a certain point. I can see what's on either side of this central shape here, which is going to comprise not really just a single part of the nose, but a lot of the nose. So there are going to be multiple kind of components, the bone structure, the cartilaginous part in through here, and obviously what we have right there isn't sufficient, but it's a good start. It's a good start from the standpoint of getting all this stuff to compile into a certain placement. So that's where I'm going to be going with a few more strokes of the pencil as I look up into these areas. Again, I've got the asymmetry. Again, I've got the dark and light question. I've got the hybrid concern of where can I start to pick out basic structure and where can I construct with the optical truth of what I'm seeing. So I'm going to look at all these components, and I'm also going to try to keep my eye focused on everything. I keep taking my hair back, pulling it back, and looking at the other ear, even if I'm not going to include that in the final drawing. And also keep turning my head because I want to look at what this part of the angle of the jaw actually comprises, even though I'm looking at it in a way that I would probably not suspect it's structured in that sense. But you see, it's so foreshortened, and that's the way these things are. They get so foreshortened, and your eyes become so used to seeing them in a certain way that it becomes hard to question optical reads. So, you just have to keep moving your head around until you get a better sense of what you're after. So that's really it. So to reiterate, you want to go for a certain kind of development of shape, and then just sit on that phase and mess with it until you get the right relationship, which is a much better prescribed manner than pushing through the value range and trying to now nail down the shapes, the basic structures, and the values. It's a lot to think about, and it could derail your process if you're not sort of astute on what you want and when you want it. So part of this is going to be trying to pull the form back in space. The hatch marks are going to become a bigger concern as well. They're going to have to contribute to the way that forms roll back. And as each and every one of these is placed and positioned, it has an effect on things you've already drawn. So that's another really strange thing. It's been said before in various settings that when you change the toe, you change the whole pose. And it's really true because everything is relating to everything else. So we have that kind of tendency to want to back away every time we make a mark. And I get a different configuration of my forehead planes. Some of this is going to really have to engage with those little pockets of form that really sit behind temporal ridge and also really sit on the edge, really along the perimeter of just the other side of zygomatic, as well as this territory, which is not often dealt with because it's so foreshortened that also sits right around the angle of the jaw. So again, I'll roll out, roll back, come out, come back, and see what I can do now to instill a sense of what I know is happening into what I already see. And that's a big difference than being faithful to a peculiar pattern of light and dark that got you started. As you see, the more you understand that there are things that are happening before your very eyes that don't look right. And at the same time, you look at a photo of yourself or you look in the mirror and you see certain things happening and you realize you have to put those in or imply those characteristics into a portrait. And that makes the process all the more really incredible because you're starting to deviate from what is really going on. You're working out of your memory in some respect. You're working from an ideal sense of form and a relationship to drawings and paintings that you've been studying and admiring for your entire life. So all those things start to weigh your eye down, but not really in a negative sense. What they do is they empower you to be able to question what you're seeing because you're trying to impart a finer aesthetic sense to it. And the question of beauty starts to take hold. So that's where I am. I'm going to push on some of these perimeter shapes just a little more, keep the value range essentially where it is, and then come back and explain the very end of this phase before we move on to multiple value engagement. I've spent the last few minutes moving the shapes around and also alternating between several different kinds of pencils, among which are F, HB, B, and now I'm on 2B with Mitsubishi Hi-uni. And one of the reasons why I've been drawing more in between takes and then explaining more on camera is because I want to make sure that I get the drawing realized to a certain level where I can explain it, but also in going back and watching this, I noticed my hand was covering up a lot of what I was trying to say. So I'm going to grab the stump now and point out a few areas that I think are significant and that really contribute to improvement in a drawing of this type. So again, the light is very instructive. You want to keep your eye on the prize, which is to learn as much as you possibly can about those enduring features of the face and follow them. So one of the things that we're looking for is how much interconnectedness can we get with certain areas. So I'm going to try to connect some of these kinds of lines and just say this type of consideration is valuable. And of course, if you're going to do it, you got to double it up this way, wherever these seem to communicate and what they seem to express. Also, while I'm in this region, it's useful to point out that I don't have very much detail here, because the more I put detail into this, the more sort of human it becomes and it fleshes out, and suddenly you're left with a kind of psychological challenge and a problem of more of a kind of inner descriptiveness of personality. And I still really want to get there, but I want to get there through the framework, through that kind of marvelous ebb and flow, and almost sort of like a water type metaphor I have for these currents in the face. So I can get to those currents and access them more efficiently if I leave this less focused on. But the best I've got right now is a kind of descending hatch, which you can see in both this framework as well as on that side in that framework. And of course, the reason for that is not only to connect the shadow to the shadow or midtone to the midtone, but also to issue the idea of an inward-facing planar structure, kind of eye socket which captures and then protects the eye. So elsewhere, that idea of unity is on full display in a region such as this. There is a lot of detail in this, but it's not necessary to go after at this point in time. Instead, I'm focused more on these moments, these kinds of, I call them catch points earlier on, these things which really drive form making and proportional comparison. So I've got a shape here which is going to contain the plane of that shadow mass and contain and delineate the plane of this light mass, which is resulting from that raking source on the side. I've also got, what else? The information that the nasal bone will indicate. This goes right back to the landmarks. I've got a very similar scenario on this side that I had on that side, and then I've got the change, the hatch mark shift that happens to again delineate or to separate this overall surface from what's next to it on either side. Also, I've gone in the direction of revising and then re-revising the corner of the jaw to try to sort of see more of a volumetric look to things. This involves a lot of thought, not only observation, but the sort of conceptualization that would seem to indicate that a mouth can be contained and then framed out by this structure here. So when I'm looking at my own jaw in these areas, I don't see as much volume from the mirror, but as I turn my head, I keep looking under my jaw, I keep looking on this side of my jaw, I'll check it from different views, and I know that it has to encompass the mouth. I know that it has to feel like it not only frames the mouth, as I mentioned a moment ago, but also that the perspective and the foreshortening is believably so. That way I can get a sense that the mouth is fitting properly and that the area that surrounds it has a bony framework, but also has a, sort of loans itself to the rhythmic soft stuff that again flows underneath the jaw and comes out on the other side. So with all of that, I continue to study the midline and the way that certain things are going to be pushed out, other things are going to be pulled in. This being one of the most primary of all, because if it doesn't work, everything falls apart. And I have gone down and into these areas to explore some of the large formatting that happens in the throat, some of the pieces that will coalesce into a sort of sharper throat mass, and some of the twists that may occur in the neck. I've got different markers back in here and in here to, again, hopefully get a feeling of the neck falling back in space. I've got some uneven characteristics, which I want to go for as the draped form drops out from the neck and enters into the shoulder region. Also, I've gone up into these areas and I've tried to trace out the perimeter of the forehead area as well as the temporal area. And then over on this side, I've got, thankfully, a lot more information about that same type of region. So this also takes me back to that beginning explanation of how important the frontal eminence is going to be for placement, for perspective, for understanding the way that things are hanging and falling and coming together in some respect. See, they come together here just as that region was coming together there. So in addition to these, I've looked rather thoroughly at this particular form. I do think it's very important. I do want to couple it with its partner over here, and I want to make sure that what is portrayed is feeling like it's falling back in space and permitting enough room, a healthy amount of space to afford the masseter plane and other things. So that's just the kind of attention and sort of the kind of time that one needs to take to get things up to a certain resolution. Once they're there, you kind of feel it. You get a sense that the momentum has been set. You get a feeling that what you've searched for feels in a sense right, and it's time to push on and really launch into a multi-value system or some sort of way of expressing the middle portion of your drawing and then on to the finish. So I would call this very much the end of the beginning, if that makes any sense, the end of the initiation of the drawing. So what I'm going to do next is launch indeed into that multi-value system and see where it takes me. I'll use some softer pencils, again, probably Mitsubishi Hi-uni again, and then return and explain as I go. All right, I'm on the drawing and pushing the values just a little bit more. We moved the camera angle because we could see from the other angle that not only was there some distortion to the image, but there was also some glare. So as soon as we get into these darker values of graphite, especially as we move into the 3B, 4B, possibly even 5 and 6B range, we get into the kind of silvery characteristics that artists have a love-hate relationship with. So we move the camera angle over to reduce the distortion and reduce the silver characteristics of the drawing. So hopefully you're getting a much better sense of it. And you can see in the midst of this that I've gone through and just hit the values. I started really kind of driving some of the graphite into the paper and throughout the design to start to create some separation between the areas of light and dark, essentially. Also to work the beginnings of a sense of turn in the transitions from light to dark or from dark to light. I did this with a 4B, a Mitsubishi 4B. This is an Uni, as well as with my 2B Hi-uni pencil. So I'm staying well within the Mitsubishi range, and I'm moving into the darker regions. Along with this, the notions of direction become more interesting and more important, and the feeling of the paper itself, the sort of granulation of the paper, which can be a factor depending on how you stroke the pencil. So you can see some elements of that in through here as the shape is unified. I want to say what I said earlier. It's well worth reiterating because as a workshop teacher for well more than 20 years, I can tell you without a doubt that the tendency everyone has is to go in and create an eyeball. The tendency is to go in and create a mouth. The tendency is to go in and create all nameable forms that we almost have a photographic expectation of, and then we try to pseudo-finish them, and then we get panicked because they don't look right. and so we've thrown everything into them. They've got a lot of hard edges, they've got a lot of, quote, resolution, and yet they don't fit together. So one of the keys, it seems to me at least, in my opinion, is to have a lot of patience with the process and to be very open to alterations, things that would shift in terms of facial expression, things that might change in terms of the impact of dark and light. This is the time, as the values go in, where very subtle changes take place. So one of the good things is to be mindful of those and to be open to those, to be, for example, open to the idea that when you're working, you're engaged, and when you stop working, you need to disengage because you've got to refresh your eye. You've got to take a step out of the situation and just kind of reset all of your parameters. I've been in more and more workshops recently where individuals feel like, or at least the inclination is that they're making the most use of their time in the studio. So they take a picture of the model and they work on the photograph of the model on break, and then they go back to the living model during pose. And I actually really discourage that, not only because there's a difficulty in translating a flat image of a person into a three-dimensional engagement, but also because you just don't give your eye a rest. So you've got to give your eye a certain pacing through an exercise, especially one this intense, where you find yourself going for a while and then getting really exhausted. So pacing is a big part of this. Aside from the pacing question and the reiteration of the psychology that we're really dealing with, the next thing is more of a technical thing, and that is, as I look at the directions, as I see these directions, every single direction has to make a difference, has to make a statement about the form with which it contends. The forms surround the structure. None of the forms in and of themselves are simple forms. There's always a kind of threading. There's always a kind of overlapping, and oftentimes there are options on how you might handle a form. I've got at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different directions in this essentially square inch of the drawing. And all of those are meaningful because they lay out an incomplete sense of form resolution for me. So I can look at this and I can say, well, the zygomatic is going to roll this way. And I might look at that more thoroughly tomorrow. The zygomatic also rolls this way. The zygomatic also, in a kind of lateral sense, sweeps in that direction. The zygomatic tends to pinpoint parts of its location in this pocket of shadow. And all those things are true, and I think it's really delightful to leave many of those things unresolved. In fact, they're all unresolved, which makes this a kind of notebook of observations, maybe a record, and in some sense maybe a chronicle, which is, I think, one of the best things about a self-portrait. So this is where the whole gist of the video is for me. I'm working to certain points, and then I stop and point out certain aspects that I think are helpful for you. So, in the next part of the video, what I'm going to do is grab something darker, and I'm going to start to push. As a matter of fact, in a new session, I'm going to push into the darker areas. I'm going to darken down all of this, and once I darken down this region, not only will it change, but the whole expression will shift, and the read of the impact of the light side will also shift. It's an amazing kind of inverse relationship, that the darker I go with this area, as well as these, the lighter I'm going to get with these other areas. And I think that's going to be a fun game to play with in the kind of sort of mid to late phase of the middle drawing. Once that's worked out, I'll spend a limited amount of time modeling some parts of the head, and that will complete the drawing and complete the demo, and hopefully give you some good things to think about and work with in the future. This is the third of 3 sessions on the drawing in an attempt to manage the process better for you and kind of reveal a little bit of what goes on in the development of the piece. In a material sense, I've got a couple of additions. I've got these 2 Staedtler pencils. Staedtler is a great company. It's been around for a long time. They make an amazing pencil called a Lumograph. This is an EE Lumograph and an EB. These are still readily available today. They fall under the moniker of 6B and 8B in the Mars Lumograph 100 set that's, like I said, available today. I've also got a Cretacolor HB, and I've got a Cretacolor Monolith 2B. And the Monolith pencils are really good because they have a kind of an all-lead pencil quality, so you can get a more varied line with those kinds of materials. The last thing is I've got a Mars Lumograph Black, and so I'm going to hit the drawing with some tonality now that really goes a little bit more in the direction of depth and not so much reflection or shine or even sheen on the surface of the graphite. And that's what these pencils are really good for. They take the overall feeling of the graphite kind of coalescing together as particles on the paper surface, and they give them a sort of matted quality, as well as a deeper dark. So I'm going to do this in an area that I would describe as a kind of safe area along the drawing first, because I'm dealing with the calligraphy of the finish, and a lot of us know how that plays out. The directions that you use near the end of the drawing are so critically important for how the drawing feels as a successful piece. So part of what you can see me lay in here is this almost crayon look of the Staedtler EB. What it does is it goes in and combines with the existing graphite. It's a little bit of a sort of a different thing, like a different animal, but that's what makes drawing really great, because the graphite goes into the piece and the graphite has its own peculiar characteristics, and then what we do is we layer on top of it and we capitalize on the beauty of the graphite, which is a kind of silver point-like character, and then we get the depth of the additional materials on top of that. So you can see some of this stuff go in and really darken down, and I don't think there's going to be too much in the way of contrast with these particular values. It's a really nice value I'm getting with that Lumograph. If I want to go in and make it more sort of even, the Monolith will go on top of that, and it will spread out as though with oil paint we're hitting a passage of who knows what, cadmium green or something like that, Prussian blue. So the Monolith will take it back to the sheen, but it will also spread out the graphite materials, or I should say particles. So that deepens the range. That, as I was alluding to earlier, makes it so that we can further the drawing and push the drawing, because once this kind of thing goes in, this characteristic, everything else kind of bleaches out in terms of light and dark effect. It would be sort of akin to moving your lens across a scene. Let's call it like a scene that has a sunset in it, and as soon as you put the sun in the scene, everything else goes way dark. As soon as you pull the lens away from the sun, everything kind of changes in its tonal structure. So not different at all in this case. Okay, so as to the directions are about the fall of the form. The hair in this case, what's left of it, is falling and sort of turning inward, almost like a spiral, as it is so often, wanting to be. So it will fall, it will become a sort of extended expression of the human figure at all times. So a good place to begin would be not only the hair in terms of tonality, but it's a good place to test out vigorous mark making so that we can decide, what sort of width of line we want, what sort of depth we want to instill in terms of the darkness and the cohesiveness of the tonality. And then we'll go back into this area and develop that in turn. Really significant to notice that it's not all sort of needlepoint line work that's being put in here. Broad lines, thick lines can be really effective lines because they add a variety to the image and they give the viewer something to hold on to and to grab onto and to sort of enjoy. There we go. And there's that sort of strange characteristic of the darker substance kind of going in there and darkening down. Again, almost like paint. Put the lumograph black down. Really great opportunity to push that value down, see where it goes, drop it, create a sense of luminosity. And pull some of this information across. And through. It's really hard to teach the mark making because everybody has to go with their own feel for things. I'm not really fond of trying to, force somebody into a certain treatment of a certain area. But my best advice on the mark making is to do sculpture, and especially with hair, to think sculpture, or maybe to think sculpturally because the hair is such an amazingly instructive thing. When you look at great sculpture like the Laocoon head, that's just got incredible hair to study, in so much as the curls of the Laocoon figures, especially the lead figure, conduct themselves in such amazing ways. Really a remarkable piece. So next thing I'm going to work on is a kind of overall graphite layer in so much as I can make things cover up. And get rid of some of these highlights. And I'm doing this with the Monolith, with the Cretacolor, and I can twist the point around and get different kinds of lines if I need to. My directions have everything to do with the plane that I'm dealing with, the planes of the head. If you want more information on this, or if you want to get more of an insight into this besides sculpture, which is the same recommendation as before, my advice is check out Vanderpool. John H. Vanderpool, the human figure, from 1907. So now I'm going to treat these areas with a certain tonality in addition to a direction. The direction is key because I want the feeling of the form to really work. I want this, speaking of chiseled, I want this to feel like it's moving up and over. And you can see the darker this gets and the darker that gets, the lighter the tone in the center gets. So as a throat direction, almost to echo omohyoid in through there. Throat direction to echo the triangles underneath the chin. Throat direction to echo maybe something dealing with sternomastoid. Just a really open thing, and a kind of let's say, a piece not to be careful with. Now I'm descending along the forehead plane here. And that'll give it some nice unity. And also take down the values. This is the plane to take us back into the cranial structure. This will be the plane that you will recall I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk. Sitting right there in the middle of everything. So I can deepen that down. Then I can take this main sort of passage of tonality and develop that also. Some of these directions are really interesting because if you've done sculpture, you know what it means to take a rake and go that direction, or go this direction along the cheekbone, or something along those lines. This is as far as I want to take the drawing for this video and for this lesson on drawing the self-portrait. There are so many things that one can get into as it pertains to subtlety, mid-tone, hatch mark, feature development, edge work. It really requires a longer video to explain that, and even more so, preferably a one-on-one or even a physical space occupancy kind of lesson we can go through together. At some point it would be good to do a longer form video, like I'm saying. But for now I want to explain some of what I've done because I know I've developed this a lot. One of the reasons why I've done more development in between these takes is because the work is so subtle that I can't imagine it being noticeable in some cases, as interesting as it is to me for the viewer. So I opted to go in and make changes, come out and explain those changes to you during the film. So as you look and survey this, you can see a lot of darker pieces that have been pushed in with that Mars Staedtler Lumograph Dark, that 8B, 6B combination, as well as some passages that I worked over with the Cretacolor Monolith pencil to drop the middle tones into a sort of depth read. I also started to look even more carefully at the hatch mark directions and the contrasts, as well as the kind of unity of taking those hatch marks and allowing certain pieces to sit back and not really grab your attention too much. I want the attention more here and quite possibly in through here. And then as this projects forward, I want the attention more in through there. So later on in the drawing, you find yourself not so much resolving all the forms, but organizing and crafting and choreographing, almost conducting the attention-getting areas of your piece. And that's what makes this much more of a personal thing. Getting back to the original question of what is worth seeing, I think near the end of an experience like this, where you've really laid it all on the line and you've gone in and chronicled yourself and scrutinized your own face and beheld the changes in your face, both positive and negative, and surveyed everything, it really is a question in some sense of working through, almost like a piece of poetry. You have to find the right markers, the right moments that speak to what you want to speak to. So I've got something like this to project and to catch light and the mark itself, as we all know, marks can contain hesitancy, they can contain fluidity, so we're looking for a certain degree of fluidity and structure coming through. We're looking for a certain capacity of light scraping along the bottom to project this area forward. This was a particularly fun region to work on. Didn't leave it till the last, but started to look into it as a matter of juxtaposing dark edge work up against form that must feel like it's kind of weightless, is the word I would use for this form. This, of course, is a bridge into the region and through here, which really wants to catch light and separate from the front versus the side. And then you see me hitting that hatch mark there and curving the hatch mark up through the temporal area, letting some of, again, what's left of my hair drop across this region and fall. There are other things where the mark making can just be more open and through here as the form settles against the shoulders. There's a poignancy there where the top of my shoulder hits in a certain respect and travels into the head. And then I've got to go to this other side and, in a way, cultivate what's happening, but also de-emphasize this area so that I can bring that much more forward. So this is one of the things about working the drawing, knowing where you want to place your emphasis. It doesn't go on every word in the poem. It goes on just a couple of things that really need to permeate your message and get your point across. So I have worked along the periphery a little bit less, but still enough to push the contrasts in the middle out and pursue something much more clearly defined. Also, I've tried not to completely resolve everything. I want there to be an openness to the entire drawing, because I continue to be open as I look at the piece, and I kind of feel like that's the way I like to draw. Not to finish, but to keep everything sort of in flux, so that as I look at what I'm doing, I can change what I'm doing in accordance with, learning or reconstituting or changing the emphasis, something along those lines. So that's really the gist of this this piece, and I think that we'll call it a video, shall we? Thank you very much for watching, and good luck drawing the portrait.